So last week we talked about suffering, um, and specifically having to or not suffering, sorry, submission, and specifically having to submit to the government to continue to pay taxes, to maybe adhere to the king or the president or the Congress or Parliament or whatever, even if we don't necessarily want. We also went through our workforce and things that we have to be submissive in at times, even when that's tough to be, or just sort of accepting the role that we have in life. And after class, every time you teach class, there's always a couple of people that come up to you and talk to you, just give another comment or opinion. Feel free to do that during class. That's what I would like. I'm hoping today, actually, what I'd like to do is sort of open that up more. Right? When we're in a auditorium type of class, which is all we have right now, a lot of times it kind of creates more of a lecture style, which I don't like. I'm fully fine with you just spitting it out and saying what you want to say. I'm cool with it, right? Maybe indicate that you're going to do it. But after class, people were kind of talking, and we were talking about the government, and there's things that I could do that, I don't really like it, and if I don't do it, no one's going to know. And if they don't know what they don't know, don't hurt them, right? Actually, it was Jason Crowell was not here today. He made a really good point that I wish that I would have made, so I'm saying it came from him because it was his own thought. But that in all of the verses that we read last week and all of the ones that we're about to read today, there is not a time in those verses that says, if I want to, right? I will submit if I want to, right? And we do joke sometimes about the government, what we don't like. I know I joked around about paying your car tax and how annoying that is because you already did that once. And if you pay property tax, if you don't pay property tax, they take your home, but you pay for your home, you own your home, but you don't own your home because you got to pay property tax, right? It's a thing that's annoying, and we can talk about it ad nauseum, right? But that's just how it is, and he had just brought up a really good point that at no point in any of those verses does it say, if I want. I thought that was a really good point to be made. And that really goes into what we're going to talk about today, which I think I would not consider myself an expert in marriage in any way. I've been married for 13 years, so I think I have, some expertise there. There are a lot of people in this room that are much more expert than I, and I always love to get some input there because we always need more help, right? And it really applies, I think, to this that sentiment that Jason had brought up. I think really applies a lot to the next part because we get married, right? And we're supposed to submit to one another, and we think that part is easy, right? Oh, it's super easy to submit to my wife or to my husband because this is what we've committed to do, right? But if everybody in this room who is married knows that is not a true statement, it is not really easy to be submissive, both as a wife and as a husband. Is it? I mean, I guess show of hands, who thinks it's really easy to be submissive all the time? A lot of men did not raise their hands. All right, we might have a problem. But it's true, right? It is work. There's a lot of effort that goes into marriage. Does anybody in here think that they have the perfect marriage? That's right. So I bring that up because, again, I just thought that was a good thing for him to say because when we read what we're about to read, I think there are times when we read even reading the Bible, when we discuss the roles of marriage, be that women and men, not everybody, but especially in 2026 and as time will go on, people really want to reject what it has to say, right? Or we want to bend what it says to fit how we feel about our marriage, my role, how I'm supposed to be a husband, how I'm supposed to be a wife, right? And I think that this can be a very difficult and hard conversation. And a part of me is like, that's fine. Let's have a difficult, hard conversation. Sometimes I think in Bible class, we really try to avoid that. You know, I am fine with opening it up, but I might not have all the answers. I definitely don't. Scott Boatwright does. He's an elder. All right. So, all right. Without further ado, what I want to do is just read through verses 1 through 7. We'll get in a little bit in the suffering a little bit later in the chapter. But we'll read through verses 1 through 7. Somebody read that for me. And if so, loudly, proudly. 1 through 7, please. Sorry. 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. Yep, you got it. All right, thank you. In that section, it was 1 through 7. I think 8 follows that up. We'll get into that in a second. But in this submission in marriage, like I said, a lot of times it can be difficult to even read something like this, right? Because there are, if we're being honest, probably a lot of marriages that the woman feels like they have to be the head of the household. Is that correct? You would say, you think, maybe? Right? Or at times, a husband will not live with their wife in an understanding way because they will take the idea of being the Lord of the house maybe a little bit too far, right? I think what Peter is encouraging us to do is to live with respectful conduct, with purity, gentle spirit, and a confidence in God. That is what he's asking us to do. Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up, though, because I think we see this a lot of times in the secular world, is people talking about falling out of love or falling out of maybe respect for one another. Has anybody ever heard anybody say that? Right? So verse 1, in the same way, you wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won over without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your pure and respectful behavior. What does that mean? What does that mean? The wives in the room, what does that mean to you? I'm genuinely asking when you read. Yeah. Influence of your example, right? But this is clearly your husband is not being obedient, right? Not being the Christian example that he should be. We see this happen all the time, right? I would say in my lifetime, we find more women that show up to church and they're like, well, their husband just doesn't come. Sometimes it's the other way around, but I would say the majority of the time, it's the woman continues to go to church and the man isn't showing up. And I do think that, yeah, go ahead. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's the perfect example of what I was about to follow up with a little bit. So that was good, right? 'Cause it's not just that was an example we see a lot of, a lot of times the man will just stop from church or whatever, but sometimes it's what you said, right? Men, how often do we sort of maybe get in our own way a little bit, right? Sometimes hobbies kind of take over our life. Maybe we start to put them in front of things, or maybe not hobbies, work. There's a lot of people, I meet a lot of people that almost take a lot of pride in how much they work, right? You see big influencers like Grant Cardone and some of these other guys. I'm not saying they don't have like some good advice, but his big thing is what, like, work like 90 hours a week or whatever. Or I saw one where a guy's like, if I work 6 hours, 6 hours, 6 hours, I'm 12 hours, I'm already way ahead of you working. Sometimes I think we can really put that in front of us. I think that's a good point to be made, because if your husbands are not following the Lord or the Word, does that mean he is no longer the Lord of the house? Yeah, yeah. Thank you. It, I think you're right. It is geared toward, if you're married to someone who is not a believer. And I think that the reflection of what we've seen in Jesus, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to suffer for someone who seems to want to reject you, right? Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. I don't think that's what that means at all. Yeah, yeah. It is very much specific to we have roles in the family, right? We have roles in the marriage that God wants to be defined. So that doesn't mean, be quiet at all times or I am your boss, right? But it does. Go ahead. No. I completely agree with you. And I always think back to we had a Bible study a couple years ago. We were reading a book. I can't remember what it's called now, but at the end of every chapter, it was like it was a marriage book, Love and Respect, I think is what it was called. And it's a good book. I'm not putting the book down. What I'm saying though is like at the end of every chapter, my wife and I would get in the car after the Bible study and be like, "Yeah, so the way to resolve it is to talk to each other, right?" All of the things that you can resolve in your marriage is if you just talk and tell the truth. That's a big thing, right? But specifically, and it goes in verse 3, your adornment must not merely the external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on apparel, but it should be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit. And you said quiet spirit, not shut up, right? Which is precious in the sight of God. Right, like it's not about just waking up and putting yourself together and putting on a show either for your wife or for the people outside, or for your husband or the people outside. Because I don't also think that this verse is saying that you're not allowed to wear jewelry or you're not allowed to do these things. But it is the spirit in which in which we do. And I put down, what is submission not? It's not accepting abuse, approving sin, being silent when God commands obedience, right? It's not accepting some of those things. Your husband is not following the word. I don't just accept it, wake up in the morning, adorn myself how I would, and go on, right? It is about having the right spirit. For in this way, holy women of former times who hoped in God also used to adorn themselves, being subject to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have proved to be her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. And I looked that up. It's interesting. So the passage that is being quoted here or referenced to by Peter is Genesis 18, specifically in verse 12. Genesis 18:12 says, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have become old, am I to have pleasure, my Lord being old also? This is when Jesus is, or when God is saying they will have a child, which is old, and Sarah laughed, right? And it says the word Lord is referenced to Abraham. So they are a team together, right, as we said, but she does make, I don't know if every translation says that, but in that translation, my translation, it does. So he is the one that, God speaks to through him, right? And it's interesting that he uses this specific example, because in verse 13, but the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I actually give birth to a child when I'm so old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? In this particular moment, we actually bring this scripture up a lot to talk about how, Sarah laughed at God. But this is what he's used, the reference that he's using to talk about Sarah and her role in that family, right? Abraham was the head of the household. Sarah bore the children. She bore Isaac. She's not a head, but they're a team. Yes. Mhm. It's actually a really good point, and I had put that down. I liked it. I may have misspoke there. You are right. That was actually one of the points I was going to make, is that um, when you look at other scriptures, most times, or every time there's a comparison, and they do this comparison a lot, it is wives submit, husbands love and respect, right? In Ephesians 5:21 through 33, that's what it is. Wives, submit yourself unto your husbands as unto the Lord. But then in 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Colossians 3:18-19, wives, submit yourself unto your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh to them, right? Same thing in 1 Peter, right? Wives, be subject to your own husbands. And then in verse 7, you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, right? That's a good point. All of these verses are actually not telling the husbands to submit to their wives. It is to love them and show respect to them. And I like the idea. I was thinking about the weaker, right? What Scott Beyer talked about in his lesson when we went over Romans, about the weaker brother and the stronger brother, right? I think that kind of applies here as well. Yeah. Yeah. There's an understanding between them. Agreed. Yeah. 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 It is. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point because we would use that as sort of Abraham would be doing this thing, and Sarah very well could have been like, "Well, this sounds like a bad idea. I'm not in." Right? And then she's commended for doing it. I think that sort of it leads me to think a lot of times about people in marriages where it's like my husband is working really hard, but he's not, and I'm not saying anybody in here does this, I'm just saying what you hear in the world, maybe he's not making enough money, but I want him to do more, right? Or I'm not able to buy or pay for the things that I want. But likewise, men, you got to go to work. You can't just sit around all day. You have to be the Lord of your home. You have to be able to be in position to make those calls, right? Because like you had brought up last week, is a very difficult thing to do, right? Yeah. Yep. Yep. That is the story, the submission story of my family, right? Like, my wife is not in here. She very much wants not that van outside. And I was like, vans get good gas mileage. You can take the seats out of them and turn them into a truck. They last forever. They can put all our kids in. There's a TV. It's practical. So she submitted, and we have the van. All right, yes. I think that's in Proverbs, right? Right? John's not here, but I think we all know what he would say. I agree. And I think that's why I wanted to open it a little bit with what Jason had mentioned before, which is in submission, in service, there is not a point in any of these yet that we've read that still says, if I desire that or if I will. Right? And I think that's such a good point. And we look at it from the case of kind of, Scott, what you were saying is, if that husband in that scenario was like, I don't want you to go to church, right? We're not talking about submitting like, oh, well, my husband says I can't go to church, so now I can't. That would not be the way to submit in that way, right? So like I said, it's not you have the role, right? There has to be, you as the husband have to be the leader, right? But if you are in a relationship where the husband is not the spiritual leader, you can be as well. But that does not mean the marriage relationship is different in God's eyes, right? I think that's ultimately the point. And unfortunately, I do think that we do kind of revert into this, well, because like you said, it's hard work. You only known John for a year. If you have a friend and your friend is bad for you, you can just leave that friend. It'd be good for you to do so. But if you commit to someone in marriage, and a couple years later you sort of realize, man, we're not friends, it doesn't matter at all. And that's where that becomes difficult. And that's where submission becomes harder. That's where caring for one another becomes harder, right? But Jesus did that for us anyway, and continues to do that for us anyway, even though we constantly reject him over and over and over and over again. Yeah, Scott. All right, verse 8. Someone read for me 1 Peter 3 and verse 8. While you're looking, did you have something you want to say? You had your hand up earlier. Was it you? Someone did. Yeah. Well, what did you want to say? I talk too much while I'm up here. Oh, I got you. I think you bring up a good point and a good life experience, and I think too that's a good thing that a lot of us can look at. And you're unique to your situation, but we do see this quite a bit where often whenever a husband does leave or run out or whatever we may want to call it, it's hard to stick with it. There's a lot of people in your life that, and this probably happened to you too, just leave, don't stay around. And I do think that this verse is saying that it is hard. I'm sure that was very difficult on you. I know it was difficult on your kids, but I mean, look at them now. They all come to church. You have a lot of great grandkids. You know what I mean? And that was a lot toward your faith. You know what I mean? Well, that is quite literally the example that we're reading about right now. And I don't think that's bragging on yourself. I think that's a good example for a lot of us to hear, a lot of us younger couples, right, too, because there is example of somebody that had to go through something very difficult, right? But did this exact thing. You continue to submit to your husband over and over and over again, even though we all probably would have said he doesn't deserve it, is the point, right? He might not deserve it, but again, that's not the point. All right, verse 8. So thank you for sharing, by the way. I know that's difficult to do. 1 Peter 3. One day, yeah. I might go here. Yep. So mine says to sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, loving, compassionate, and humble. And that's kind of what Steve brought up earlier. This is all wrapping around based on how Jesus suffered and submitted and worked for us. Verse 9 says, not returning evil for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that it would inherit a blessing. So we sort of shift here from submission to suffering. And that's where we will continue in our lesson. In terms of suffering for doing good. One of the characteristics that we have is to be sympathetic, loving, compassionate, and humble. And all of those things seem like common sense at times. But it's like we talked about. The Bible has to tell us over and over and over these things. Why is that? Yeah, we're hard-headed. That's true, yeah. One thing I wanted to, ask, is there, in terms of being submissive or working, for some of you maybe that have been in a marriage longer than 15, 20 years, what advice would you give people on how you have learned to either work it out or to stay submissive in your marriage even when times get tough? I'm asking, this is for me, yeah. You need to step up. Yes. sometimes the reward is doing what Christ wants us to do, right? And that sometimes I think can be difficult for us to understand. One more. Yeah. Yep. Talk, tell the truth. That's what matters. All right, see you next week. Thank you.